Hello and welcome to the demonstration of Eucrasia. That's my final project. My name's Peter Guest. Hopefully you will get an idea of the key mechanics demonstrated in this prototype and see the interplay between those key mechanics and how they form the prototype as a whole. The most important mechanic of this prototype is the player health system alongside the player humoral system. So the player's health, unlike in most games, is a balancing act. The player is required to keep their health as close to the midpoint as possible. If the player's health, which is a statistic, a float that ranges from the values of 0 to 100, if the player health reaches the value of either 0 or 100, the player dies. This raises the interesting prospect of certain types of damage at some points being detrimental to the player as they bring them further away from the midpoint, and other points being a benefit to the player as they can bring them closer to the midpoint. So some sources of damage are healing at one moment and damaging at another. The way the player is aware of their current health is determined by post-processing effects that are applied to the main Unity camera through which the player views the game. Now, I can use cheat codes that I've enabled to add and remove value from the player's health statistic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add value to the player health statistic, bringing the player closer to death on the higher end of the scale from the lower end of the scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add them now. As we can see, as I press the button, the player's view gets steadily brighter, the contrast increases, and lighter areas become quite hard for the player to see. This is particularly evident on the two example textures on the right-hand side of the screen currently. The player will find their vision obstructed as they get further from health, and it gets quite evident when they are in need of healing and when they need to change their behavior to seek out other forms of damage, in inverted commas, to bring them closer to the central point of the health system. And when they do receive damage, which in this case would heal them, this is what they will see. So I'm going to press the opposite now and apply negative damage in a sense. And you can see the world beginning to darken back to the midpoint. And here we are at approximately the midpoint. The opposite, of course, is true when you are given negatively aligned damage, which the game refers to as dyscrasia, and it's perhaps useful to use this term in this case because it is not always damage, as sometimes it brings you closer to the middle, and so it heals you. So from this point forward, I'll refer to it as dyscrasia. So as the player receives negative dyscrasia, we can see the world begin to darken. The color is reduced as it gets closer to black and white, and a vignette is applied to the edges of the screen as darkness closes in around the player. While the color saturation is decreased, the contrast is actually increased, which presents the player with the interesting visual effect of whites and blacks being more pronounced, highlighting the fact that we've lost all color, or most color, and all color upon the point of death to the player. So each end of the health system, and I'll bring us back towards middle here, Each end of the health system depicts two mental states the player can find themselves in. The lower end, which we just witnessed, is torpor, and it represents the depressive end of the human range of emotions, and opposing it is delirium, which represents a more manic state of experience. And I feel as though these post-processing effects help to indicate this to the player, as they're quite representative of the emotional states they are representing. One of the key ways the game world interacts with the player's health system is through the 4 enemy types the player will encounter as they traverse the game world. From left to right, we have the 4 humours, and these are representations of these humours. And from left to right, we have choler, sanguine, melancholy, and pituitary, also known as phlegmatic. So we'll start with choler. The humoral personality of those who are choleric, and basically in humoral theory, these 4 humours, choler, sanguine, melancholy, and pituitary, or phlegm. I've avoided the use of the word phlegm because it has a more modern meaning, which I think detracts slightly from the mystique of pituitary, which generally sounds a bit more impressive than phlegm. But anyway, the 4 humours are 4 liquids that supposedly exist in the human body, and the concentrations of these liquids are what determines, or thought to be what determines, the personality of the individual. So those who have an excess of choler are natural born leaders. They are decisive, but also harsh. They're prone to violence. And so I thought that hard and jagged crystal would be the best representation of this humour in game. The 4 humours align themselves quite well with the 4 modern states of matter, being solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. And choler is the hardest of the humours, the most decisive, but also the harshest and most violent. And so solid was a good representation of that humour if it were given form. Therefore, it is a floating crystal with harsh edges, which floats across the world, seeking out the player. Following from this, we have sanguine. And sanguine translates directly as blood. And so what better way to illustrate sanguine in the game world as a floating ball of blood? As sanguine is depicted by the liquid state of matter, we can tie it directly in with the blood that it is supposed to represent, but it also has the dual purpose of illustrating the sanguine's nature when expressed as a personality. Those who were sanguine were thought to be quite flexible, good in social situations, and able to adapt to most situations with ease, just as liquid flows into whatever container. However, like a liquid, sanguine never likes to stay still, and as soon as they see a break in whatever container it is, they will flow straight through into it and move on to the next thing. The sanguine struggle to stay still as well, and never feel content in one place. This can lead to them finding themselves in dangerous situations, quite often of their own making. Next we have melancholy, who is represented by the state of matter gas. Now, melancholy is perhaps one of the most famous of the four humour types, and the term melancholy still remains in use to this day to refer to sadness and is analogous with the condition of depression. I felt that gas was the best state of matter to represent melancholy, as much like gas, melancholy can find its way through any gap. It can seep into a person's life and smother them, removing any desire for joy or excitement. And so a thick black smoke seemed fitting to represent this humour in the game world. Finally, we have pituitary, which is represented by the state of matter of plasma. Now, pituitary and phlegmatics, who have an excess of pituitary, is associated with compromise and finding the greater good of a situation. But often, those who are phlegmatic will not stick up for themselves, and they'll put the needs of others above the needs of themselves. And I felt like this desire for the ease, for the greater good, is represented well by plasma in its lightning form, because lightning, of course, is essentially plasma. And lightning always finds the path of least resistance when it strikes, much like the phlegmatic, who always finds the path of least resistance in a social context. And this allowed me to neatly wrap up the four humours into the four states of matter. Now, from a technical perspective, colour was modelled in Maya and textured in Substance Painter. We can see as well that its projectile that it fires at the player is modelled upon the orbiting crystals surrounding it. Further work could be put into this model if this prototype were to be expanded upon by having the collar enemy directly fire its orbiting crystals at the player as opposed to spawning a new one upon firing. Sanguine uses Metaball code that is available from the Unity community website. While I was originally planning to use fluid simulations in Maya's Bifrost plugin to prototype Sanguine, the end results were not quite to my liking, and I found that to make the best possible visual effect for Sanguine, it would take too much time. And so this simulation, which I believe was originally intended to be a lava lamp, I think really does a good job at showing the liquid nature of Sanguine as it floats around the world, joining and rejoining, ever shifting. The particle effect was modelled directly here in Unity, just using a few spheres, which rotate much in the same way that the Collar's projectile does. This makes it look as though it is a separate blob of liquid that is separated from the main body, with three trailing blobs following behind. Melancholy and Pituitary both were developed directly in Unity and are using Unity's in-house particle system. Now again, especially for Melancholy, I was planning on using Bifrost. However, yet again, it would be too time consuming to produce something of a high enough quality to represent the humours. And so I settled for using Unity's inbuilt system. And I'm glad I did, as it allowed me to spend more time on other systems in the game. And I believe the end result is still a compelling depiction of the designs first drafted by myself. Melancholy itself has a tail of rising smoke, which as it traverses the game world trails around it, giving you a real sense of presence in the world. Whereas Pituitary, with its sparking particles leaving purple trails behind them, is reminiscent of a plasma ball, really illustrating the intention of it depicting plasma as a state of matter. So this brings us on to some of the behind the scenes actions which determine the enemies as they appear in game. We can see in front of us an enemy prototype which illustrates some of the systems active. The two spheres which are rotating around the main enemy body represent two game objects that are children of the main enemy on all enemies. These are invisible on the final enemy models, however they are still present on them. What these two spheres do is act as emitters for two of the features of the enemies. The first and blue sphere is the enemy's weapon, and this will emit a projectile, as we saw next to the enemies over there, every 5 seconds, and this is adjustable to really get a sense of balance, so we could have the enemies firing at any delay. And this could perhaps be expanded upon in difficulty ratings, where at a higher difficulty the enemies would fire more regularly, and at a lower difficulty they would fire irregularly. The lower red sphere is a particle emitter, which emits a particle effect when the player attacks the enemy. We can see this in effect here. Now, it's important both of these rotate so they constantly face the player, and this is done by a simple C# script. As when the player strikes the enemy, the particle effect will come into play at the point of the strike. It also allows the enemy to fire its projectiles directly at the player at all times. So even if the player manages to get behind the enemy, they are still striking and displaying the particle effect at the correct location and still firing directly at the player and not somewhere in front of them. These two may appear at first glance to orbit in the same manner. However, the red particle emitter will only orbit around the y-axis and is locked to the y-axis, whereas the blue weapon will actually orbit the enemy object in a full 360 degrees, and this can be demonstrated by going up onto this level. We can see that the blue object has rotated up to face the enemy, and yeah, we can see that quite clearly here. Obviously there's distortion to the blue sphere, but this isn't a problem in the final game, as these two emitters are completely invisible. They have no mesh render attached to them on the final product. And basically this means that no matter the elevation of the player, the enemy will constantly fire directly at them. So if they're uphill from the enemy, they will be no safer than if they were directly in front of them. But this isn't really necessary for the particle effect, as usually by the time the player is close enough to strike them, all that matters is that the particle effect is spawned from the correct location. You may have heard a sound effect when the enemy was struck then, and each enemy has its own striking sound effect alongside other sound effects at different points. The player is also able to attack the enemy using 3 different attack types. The first, and I will demonstrate that now, is a single attack, which is a stab of the polearm that they use, and this is triggered using a single click. The player is able to double click, and this will perform a double attack. The first attack will do 1 damage, the double attack will do 1 damage on the first attack, and then 2 damage on the subsequent attack, encouraging the player to try and get 2 attacks off in quick succession. This of course leaves them vulnerable to being shot at by the opponent, and so is a bit of a risk-reward scenario for the player to weigh up. The player is also able to perform a third attack, which is a power attack, and they can do this by holding down Shift and clicking. And this animation reflects the additional power which is in the power attack, as it does 3 damage instead of 1 or 2. There is, however, a cooldown attached to this power attack. And so if I'm clicking now and holding Shift, nothing happens until the cooldown is over. This isn't the case with the single attack, which can be performed as soon as the animation completes, or the double attack, which also can be performed as soon as the animation completes. The player can also block, but while doing this they are unable to attack, and their movement speed is greatly reduced as the player hides behind their weapon, not looking where they're going and therefore moving with additional caution. The blocking greatly reduces the damage taken by the player when struck by an enemy projectile, but doesn't negate it completely. It does, however, negate completely the humoral imbalance which that projectile imparts upon the player, which will be expanded upon later. So if we go back to this enemy here and we perform a double attack, we see we've killed the enemy. Now, the enemy plays a separate sound upon death, as you may have noticed, and plays a different particle effect, designed to give a clear indication to the player when an enemy has been killed. Here in the distance, we can see 4 enemy prototypes, 1 for each Humour. The blue one on the left represents Pituitary, the yellow one to its right represents Collar, the black one that is closest to us represents Melancholy, and finally the right one represents Sanguine, and their colours match the 4 enemy types that we viewed before. From these 4 prototypes we can observe the AI behaviour and how it changes depending on the player's current health state. Currently, the player is at a neutral health state. They are roughly in the middle of their health range. Now this state makes all 4 enemy types aggressive towards the player as they seek to bring them away from the central balance. So as we get close enough to the enemies, we will see them begin to move towards the player and fire projectiles at the player. Now these are example projectiles in these prototypes. They move very slowly, much slower than the final enemy types, and of course they do no damage, so that we can discuss this feature without fear of the player dying. So what we're going to do, we're going to let this guy follow us and get closer to the others. And you can see as we reach a certain range, they become aware of the player and begin to chase the player. We turn around to Melancholy again, we'll see he's been following us, and we can do this with all 4 of them, and they'll jostle for position trying to face us. We can see that their shooters, their weapons, rotate a lot faster than they do, allowing them to constantly shoot directly at the player, even if we manage to outflank them. The enemies will continue to shoot like this until the player is dead, or until the player's health changes to the point where they begin to flee from the player. So using the same cheat codes I used before to demonstrate the health system, we can see how the health system interacts with the enemy behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add Discrasia to the player towards Delirium. And what we'll observe is the torpor aligned enemies, that is Melancholy and Pituitary, we'll observe them fleeing once we reach a certain health level. And I'm going to add the health in now. You can see the post-processing effect change slightly. And here we have the boundary upon which the AI changes its behavior. So what they do is they flee to beyond their detection radius, at which point they will stop. But as soon as we go any closer to them, they will begin to flee again. So this works by having an empty game object which is directly behind the enemy, and once we reach a certain health level, they are programmed to try and set their transform position to that destination, and of course it moves with them, causing them to constantly flee. We can, however, corner the enemy, as if they reach the edge or an area from which they cannot move forward, they will stop moving completely, and that gives the player an opportunity to corner the enemy and attack them, like so. So you may have noticed as the enemy died, not only did it play its particle effect as well as its on-death sound, in that case the melancholy death sound, but it also led to the player's health changing towards the center. This means that when enemies are spawned in at the opposite end of the health spectrum to you, so in this case the player is towards delirium, melancholy is towards torpor, the opposite end. So when the player kills melancholy, when they're delirious or when they're close to delirium, they are healed towards the center. When the player kills an enemy that is aligned with the player's own alignment, their current alignment, they do not receive any healing. Now we can again cheat the system slightly here by changing our health down towards torpor, and we see the behavior applied to Collar and Sanguine, and they will continue to flee away from the player as we chase them. Now the player is able to sprint, and this allows them to run faster than the enemies and catch them up to get that healing bonus. Sprint is determined by pressing shift, and so when they hold down shift and attack, you get the power attack, which allows for a faster dispatch of the enemy to get that healing. Now that healing may have brought us back to the point where Collar will chase us. So what we're going to do, and also the same will go for Pituitary, who had fled to that area. So now both of them chase us, and when we go down in health, Collar begins to flee, and when we go up again in health, Pituitary begins to flee also. And Collar is back to attack us. So here we can see how the differing attack types are balanced against the health system. So the player isn't able to just sit there and let an enemy attack them to bring themselves closer to the middle point. Because if an enemy attacks them, that means that attack will bring them further from the middle point. They must actively seek out the enemies that will bring them closer to the middle health point and kill them like so. You may have noticed the differing sound effects. Now, all of these sound effects are designed to play in with the 4 states of matter representing the humours in the game world. You heard then from Pituitary the zapping sound of plasma, and the death of Collar sounded like a rock slide, linking it to its solid nature. The death sound and general ambient sound of Sanguine is that of liquid, of splashing, of being underwater, and melancholy is represented by more of whispering, more gaseous noises. This brings us into how the enemies are spawned into the game world. While there is nothing too visible in front of us, there are in fact 3 separate spawn points, which are invisible to the player, but act as triggers so that when the player enters them, instance of each enemy type is instantiated into the game. The only clue that the player has of the presence of these spawn points is the sound effect that you can hear playing now. This whispering, otherworldly sound effect is designed to complement the otherworldly nature of the enemies faced in this game. And it also provides the player with a bit of forewarning before they enter a dangerous spawn point, just so that they get that little bit of a hint that they're about to be in combat. And potentially give them the opportunity to turn around and flee should they feel that they're not ready for a combat situation. So this would allow for the game to feel less frustrating with random spawn points that you cannot at all predict, and encourages the player to be fully invested in their game world, as this auditory cue is the only one they're going to get before an attack. This is in the hopes that the player will become more fully immersed in the game world. Now we can see here that our player is using the default player skin. Now we saw before these 5 different skins, and each one represents one of the 4 humours. Running alongside the player health system is another statistical system which determines whether the player aligns with any of the 4 humours. The player can be choleric, sanguine, melancholy, phlegmatic, or a 5th default state, which is currently where the player is. Unfortunately, I was unable to implement a change in material on the player during the time constraints allowed, as I felt that the health system already indicated the current state of the player to an acceptable degree, and more time was needed to develop the enemy AI and as well the dialogue system and its interactions with the different health and humour systems. Further work would definitely be needed to better illustrate the humoral alignment system to the player. However, it is impactful on the game world, and I felt that that was more important than having the visual cue available from this prototype. As the game is developed, however, the player's texture would change depending on their humoral alignment. Each texture is illustrative of the corresponding humour and personality type which goes along with it. So for example, Pituitary here is rather plain. Their clothing is slightly dirty, and their collar and sleeves are ink stained, and they have mud on their boots and the tails of their coat. And this illustrates the phlegmatic's tendency to put the needs of others before their own. They're so busy running around looking after other people that they fail to look after themselves. Melancholy is perhaps one of the more historically authentic outfits available to the player. It's very much based on the Puritan fashions that were quite prevalent to the time. It's a simple black and white which illustrates the darkened mood of a melancholic, but also their neat primness, their desire for order and structure, and internal validation and intelligence. The default texture is perhaps the most authentic in its use of undyed fabric and simple colours, and it's probably what watchmen of the time period would have available to them for clothing. Sanguine's the most flamboyant of the options and has bright gilt thread incorporated into their clothing in flowing organic stylings which are reminiscent of the flowing nature of the sanguine. They are in stark contrast with melancholy in particular, and it really illustrates their flamboyant nature. Just as bright perhaps, but slightly less flamboyant is choleric, and they have more geometric patterns sewn into their coat, which represent their harsh nature better than the flowing patterns of sanguine. Unfortunately, yeah, these are not implemented dynamically. However, I think it's important to illustrate the potential there for their implementation. And going forth, I will apply them manually to the player to give an idea of the 4 humours in action. But be aware that this is not a dynamic system, and it is very much only possible in the editor at this point. So, returning to the spawn points, we see here a default player character with no humoral alignment. In front of them is the invisible spawn point, which you can hear from the sound effect. So if one were to enter the trigger, they would spawn an enemy. So in this case, it is sanguine. However, the enemy type is randomized. We're going to avoid the attacks to avoid anything. And look, you can see now it's spawned melancholy. We're going to evade these guys. We don't particularly want to be struck by them because that would give us an alignment. Here we have pituitary. So you can see, and obviously this is a demo area, so the houses aren't blocking them, but of course in the real game world they would be blocked by. And here we have, quite loud. Here we have collar. So you can see a random spawn of the different enemy types. And you can also hear their distinctive sound effects, which are attached to the enemy types, as well as onto the projectiles they fire at you. Each projectile has its own sound, as well as impact sound for when it strikes against an object. And as you can see, they will time out eventually and be destroyed by the game world. And so here we have a player with the choleric player texture applied, who also has the corresponding choleric alignment in their humour alignment statistic. The same spawn point, they will always spawn a choleric enemy. Here we have them. So this will always spawn choler now, as long as the player remains choleric. We can just keep running back and forward. There is a short delay between spawning and when it can next spawn, and this is adjustable in the inspector. The delay for the spawn point is adjustable in the inspector. However, currently for this demonstration, the delay is set for about, I think about 3 seconds or something along those lines. The delay in the actual game and in the final prototype playable area is much longer, and we'll wait for a few minutes before spawning another wave of enemies. Now we'll go ahead and demonstrate the different spawn points for the different human alignments. So here we have the sanguine player, demonstrated by the sanguine texture applied to him. Once we go through the spawn point now, it will spawn sanguine. So you can hear as well the sound effects. The slightly creepy, otherworldly nature of them, but all sounding sort of liquid, and having kind of that overall theme to them. Here we have a melancholy player, as evidenced by the melancholy texture applied. Once we go through again, melancholy is spawned. So here we can see in detail the tail following the melancholy around, and we can listen to the audio of both the projectiles, but also of the whistling sound of melancholy itself. And it sounds like the weapon is passing through a thick gas when we strike it. And finally here we have the phlegmatic player, illustrated by the blue texture and muddy, unkempt appearance. Once we pass through the spawn point here, pituitary is spawned. And we can listen to its avoiding the dummies who like to get involved. We can listen to its electronic almost sounding sound effects, which are based on things like arc welders. It's a blend of arc welders and tasers and the humming of a power station, in sharp contrast to the other enemy types that are more organic in nature. But this reflects its status as being representative of plasma, which is obviously not as commonly found in nature. And so we'll quickly go back to the default player texture, and we'll see the changing spawn point in a more dynamic action. But of course the textures will not change, as that was not implemented. So here we have the default player again with no alignment. We run through and it spawns a random enemy. So once we've dispatched melancholy, I'm going to give our player some alignment. Let's give him phlegmatic alignment, and now we'll see the spawning of pituitary. And then using the same cheat codes, I'm going to directly give him back a melancholy alignment. And we'll see melancholy spawn, sanguine alignment, sanguine will spawn, and again using the cheat codes, we've given him a choleric alignment, color will spawn. And so we can see it really does change dynamically with the player status and humoral alignment. Alongside the directed spawners, which always spawn an enemy aligned with the player's current humoral alignment, we have randomized spawners, which retain the random element regardless of humoral alignment. And we can observe this. The player is currently choleric. It will spawn a random enemy each time. Of course, there's a bit of a delay. We run through it again. There it is. And it spawns collar. And I'm just going to keep running backwards and forwards. Of course, there is the delay. And it will just continue to spawn random enemies. And so we can see the two types of spawn point, both targeted and random. They both give a different opportunity for different enemy types to spawn. And what we can do with this is combine different spawn points together to form wider spawn points that spawn both multiple enemies, secondarily different proportions of enemies. And this is illustrated in the final project where these spawn points are combined. So here we are in the final playable game world, along a small little diversion for the player to find themselves in, which leads to this dead end. The player is encouraged to explore the area, and so might find themselves tempted to see what this gate's all about, and they'll find themselves blocked in this steep valley, and as they approach the gate they will begin to hear the sound of an enemy spawn point. So what this spawn point is in game, and this is typical of the spawn points found in the final project game world, is in fact 3 spawn points combined into one. The first 2 are targeted spawn points, and these will both spawn an enemy matching the current player's humour. In this instance, the player is sanguine, and once they enter the trigger, 2 sanguine will be spawned. The third enemy spawn point is a randomized spawn point, and this has an equal chance of spawning any one of the 4 enemy types. This means that the player may be given an opportunity to heal themselves, as an enemy is spawned at the opposite end of the health scale. As the player is exploring the game world, they're probably going to be facing forward. However, what we're going to do is we're going to back into the spawn point, and this will allow us to watch the enemy spawn when they'd usually be spawning behind us out of sight. So what we'll do is we will back into the spawn point, and here we can see the 2 sanguine spawn along with the randomized one, which was in this case Collar. So this gives the enemy an additional challenge as they face 3 enemies that will attack them. The player must hope that they will spawn 2 targeted enemies, of course, but also a third which will allow them to chase it down and kill it for healing. So in this case, Melancholy or Pituitary would have been better for the player. The layout of this spawn point encourages the player to go into this valley, and this traps them, forcing them to combat the enemies that spawn at the mouth of the valley. And now, as we can see, we can traverse the trigger area freely, and it will be some time before enemies are spawned. This concludes the demonstration of the spawn points and enemy systems.